So it's a pleasure to be able to welcome Dani Rodrik here on the occasion, the 50th anniversary of the Center of Development Economics. In introducing Dani, I thought I wouldn't talk so much about development economics and maybe more a little bit about the development of an economist. So some of you may actually be taking economics classes, some of the students here, and you know that when you start out, your goal is to write a beautifully crafted paper and you hope that your professor will read it. Okay? Unless you go to a lesser institution, Dani's at Harvard, there you hope your teaching assistant, a graduate student, will read it. But at Williams, you hope your professor will read it. And you go on, and as the economist develops, they go to graduate school. There you very much hope that your thesis advisor might actually read your dissertation. And if it's a good dissertation, that happens. You go on, you become, as Dani did, an assistant professor, and you write articles, you send them out, and you hope that the referees of those peer-reviewed articles will actually read your work. And if you're successful, as Dani has been, the referees do it, and the papers come out in journals. And once again, you hope that people might actually read the journals. And, you know, a dozen people might read your papers. And you're humming right along. When you get to the very pinnacle of the profession, you don't write papers anymore. You have a weblog. And if you're really at the top of your game, finance ministers around the world read your blog on a regular basis. And that's exactly where Dani finds himself. Finance ministers around the world log on and see what Dani has to say. It's always provocative, it's always interesting, and it's almost always right, which is really neat. So I'm delighted to welcome Dani and look forward to hearing what he has to say.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the introduction. Thank you, Jerry, for the invitation. It's very nice to be here at this great occasion in this great theater. I thought I was going to be the after-dinner speaker in a smaller, more intimate affair, but I'm delighted that to be here. And talking to you about economic development and where the field stands. Whenever I'm asked to give a talk about the progress of some part of economics or some discipline in economics and its contribution to our knowledge and to our practice, I'd like to put economics into its proper perspective by telling a little story. So a physicist, an architect, an economist are traveling in a train. You know where I'm going? So they get to discuss as to which of their professions is the oldest and therefore most honorable. And the physician says, well, obviously it's medicine. Look, before there was any humanity, God had to fashion Eve out of Adam's rib, and what was that if that wasn't an act of surgery? So obviously medicine is the oldest of our professions. And the architect says, hold on, before there was Adam, God had to construct the entire universe out of chaos. There was an act of architecture for sure, so architecture beats medicine. And the economist turns to his friends and says, well, where do you think chaos came from? Unfortunately, this used to be just a joke. With the financial crisis, the global financial crisis that we've experienced, it is tinged with more than a dose of reality. But I want to counterbalance that, since my topic is development economics, not economics broadly. I'd like to counterbalance that by saying something nice about development economics in relation to other fields. After all, economics also contains fields like macroeconomics, financial economics, and compared to those fields, surely development economics, the relationship is between astrophysics to astrology, right? I mean, given how macroeconomists and financial economists have messed things up. So development economics hasn't been doing all that badly. But it is true that there's always been a bit of a sort of a feeling that development economics is somehow soft. It's the soft part of economics. The rest of economics is hard and rigorous, and development economics is just touchy-feely. And I think that's, to a large extent, has been the advantage of development economics, because development economists sort of never can afford to lose sight from the actual reality that they're working with. And so if you look at the kinds of models, the kinds of frameworks that macroeconomists had been working with prior to the crisis, and most of them still are at the present time, it couldn't be more divorced with reality. And I think the nice thing about development economics is that you just can't afford to do that. You're working with real institutions, real countries, real communities. So that makes a difference. And I think the further good news, and that's really the subject of my talk, is that I think recent developments in development economics are reason for further hope that we're really fashioning a discipline or sub-discipline within economics that is going to be useful to the practitioner, to the policymaker, to people on the ground. And to describe this development or these tendencies in development economics, I'm just going to put my own frame around them. It's not a frame that all development economists would agree with. So what I want to do is describe this new trend in terms of a number of new emphases. And one way to enter the subject is by talking about what I might call a difference in the frame of mind that development economists are now starting to approach problems of development policy. And I'm going to distinguish, to start with, an approach, a frame of mind that is presumptive from a frame of mind that I will call diagnostic. Presumptive versus diagnostic. And I'll caricature a little bit when I say that a lot of the pre-existing ways of thinking about development policy were based on a presumptive frame of mind, by which I mean that we presume we know what the essential obstacles, essential blockages that prevent development from taking off. So you might think, for example, that the import substitution strategy was a very different one than the Washington Consensus. After all, import substitution put a lot of emphasis on government intervention, on trade protection, on directed credit, incentivizing industrial development. And Washington Consensus was in very much the opposite, that it said that let the markets rule, get the governments out of the markets, and so forth. But one thing that they did share, I think, is that they were both, to a large extent, presumptive approaches, because they presumed, in the case of import substitution, that the answer to development, to underdevelopment, was to get government to prioritize and subsidize and protect industry. And that was how to address the fundamental bottleneck of development. And the presumption with the Washington Consensus was that the best way to get development going was to actually let markets work. So they are presumptive because they are taking a stand on what is preventing development from happening. In one case, too little government or too much markets. In the second case, too little markets and too much government. You can say the same kind of thing, the same presumptive frame is also true of sort of more recent approaches, whether it's the focus on the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, or it's the focus on the so-called governance agenda of the World Bank and others, which sort of focus on institutional reform. So the MDGs say that the way that you need to approach development everywhere across the world in the poorer countries is just to basically prioritize these various elements that are part of the Millennium Development Goals. The governance agenda says the main obstacle is that you have poor institutions. You have bad governance, so you have to fix it in order to get development. So again, you're taking a stand on both what the main obstacle to development is and what is the best way to approach it, or the best way to fix it. Now, so we've moved back and forth a lot among these different approaches. All of these approaches to development are fundamentally different, but they share this common feature that they based on this presumption that there is ex ante knowledge, that before you've fundamentally studied or invested in understanding a problem, the problems of a society, that you know what the preferred frame ought to be. The presumptive strategies, secondly, come typically with a very long list of reforms, the proverbial laundry list. We know what those are. In the case of the Washington Consensus, they were codified in the famous John Williamson's list of the 10 things, and that 10 thing became 20, the 20 became 30. As you go on to the governance agenda, the list gets longer and longer. But in all of these areas, that there is a sense that this is a complicated thing, you need to do a whole lot of things, and these agendas come with a long list of reforms. A third element, which is often very important in the actual practice, and one of the fundamental reasons why policy advice in these presumptive frames emphasizes the need to undertake a lot of reforms in different areas simultaneously, is the understanding that all these reforms are in fact complementary. So that it's not enough to do your trade reform if you don't do your public finance reform at the same time. And it's not enough to do your trade reform and public finance reform together if you don't do your labor market reforms. And that's not enough. You need to do your macroeconomic reforms as well, because there are complementarities across these different areas, and that even with the best of intentions, you're going to fail if you have if you leave the menu unfilled. So for that reason, for example, I know one of the sessions today was on Washington Consensus, but the defenders of Washington Consensus today, there are some, will say the Washington Consensus didn't fail. It just wasn't tried. Because there are always things on that agenda that the government hasn't done that may not have completely done, and therefore you can always turn around and say, they may have done the trade reform and they did the privatization, but they didn't do their labor market reforms, and that's why they ended up not performing as they did. Okay? So this comes from the notion that all these reforms are actually complementary. And finally, I think many of these reform attempts come with an understanding of what one might call a best practice frame of mind. That there is, once you decide, for example, in the import substitution frame, that you need industrial policy, there's a focus on, okay, what's the best kind of industrial policy? And if Brazil did something that worked, then Argentina and Chile have got to be doing the same thing. Similarly, with respect to the Washington Consensus, if the Chilean pension reform ends up being the way to do pension reform, or the Mexican program on poverty reduction seems to work, then that becomes a best practice for other countries to want to emulate. So this push for a universal recipes, best practices, and relatively clear-cut rules of thumb, I think has been an element in these traditional ways of approaching development. Now, I want to distinguish this frame of mind with what I see as sort of this new trend in thinking about development policy, which on all these counts takes a rather different view. So the focus is, rather than on presuming what the bottleneck, what the fundamental developmental problem is in a universal fashion, the focus ends up being on diagnosing where the most important bottlenecks are. So you start from a presumption of much greater lack of knowledge than before. You start presuming less. And you start presuming that you have to do the diagnostic first. You start saying, we do not know ex ante what works and what doesn't. Okay? That's a presumptive. And you say, what we need to do is look at the specific binding constraint, the specific obstacles, the specific blockages that seem to be the most severe for the specific country, the specific economy, or the specific community that you're examining. Okay? And here the focus becomes context specificity, because the moment you say you need to look for binding constraints, you are saying that the binding constraints in different parts of the world, in different countries, are going to be different. So the answer, the policy, is going to be, for the same reason, different. Third, you say that because we start with a lot of uncertainty about what the underlying source of the problem is, or the most severe most severe constraint is, we are going to take the idea of experimentation a lot more seriously. We're going to internalize that often we'll be wrong in our initial diagnosis. Often our policies geared towards unlocking these constraints will not be effective. And therefore, we need to experiment. We need to have an experimental frame of mind rather than a frame of mind that says, here's a policy that we know has worked elsewhere, here's the problem, and here's the best practice. Okay? And because experimentation is by its nature uncertain, you need to invest a lot, therefore, on monitoring and evaluating what the impact of those experiments, those policy experiments are, whether things are actually working or not working, and then be ready to change your policies as they prove successful or unsuccessful. Second big element, second big heading, again in distinction to the previous frame of mind, is that the focus ends up being not on long laundry list of reforms. You need to do your trade, your public finance, your macro, your labor market, your governance, your social safety nets all at once. Instead, the focus ends up to be on a much more selective, more narrowly targeted set of reforms, because you say, my objective is to target the binding constraint, the most severe problem. And that's where I'm going to be putting all my greatest effort. So I'm going to focus on a narrower range of reforms rather than spreading myself thin and targeting a whole range of areas all simultaneously. So selectivity and narrower targeting of reforms. Now, the idea that that's the way to go is supported by the notion that this being developing countries, and developing countries being societies where a lot of things have gone wrong, where societies that are so far away from the frontier, that are all these technologies and markets that are out there, the potential convergence, the potential catch-up is so large that you don't need to do a whole lot of things to get economic dynamism, economic growth going on at low levels of income or even middle levels of income until you get close to the frontier. That's one big advantage the developing countries have. They're so far from the frontier, they're so screwed up, if I can use the colloquial, that you don't actually need to get a lot of things right to get a lot of mileage, to get some action going. And that is true. If you look around the world, the countries that have had very sort of sustained, increased very rapid economic growth, you go and ask sort of, what did they do initially to get that growth going? Often you can't even identify a lot of reforms that got them going. They seem to have hit some binding constraint. And finally, again in distinction with the previous, in this frame of mind, you tend to stay away. You tend to take with considerable grain of salt the idea of a best practice. The idea that there is some universal recipe, that there is some general rule of thumb that you can sort of apply. Because again, the issue is context specificity. Given the deeply second best environments in which you're working, given the very different political economy that you confront, and given the very different nature of what the binding constraint might be in different societies, the manner in which you're going to be unlocking this potential is going to potentially be very different from society to society. And what works in one setting is not going to work in another. So you take the idea of a best practice as a starting point, but not as necessarily something that you will go with ultimately. I think if there's sort of one litmus test, if you want to sort of at this point, you want to ask yourself, am I a presumptive kind of a person or a diagnostic kind of a person? Right? This is the litmus test. Ask yourself the question, do I believe that there is an unconditional and unambiguous mapping from specific economic policies to economic outcomes? Okay? So what does that mean? It means can I always say that if I reduce a country's average tariffs from 20% to 10%, that country's economic growth rate will increase? Can I always say that if particular parastatals are privatized, that this country will perform better? Can I always say that if I privatize this pension system, or if its central bank becomes independent, or if that country moves to inflation targeting and exchange rate floating, that this country will improve its economic performance? If you are carrying the notion that the answer to these is, or at least one or similar questions is yes, then you're in the presumptive mode of thinking. If your answer is, I don't know, it depends, well, hard question, I need to know a lot more, then you're potential convert to the diagnostic way of looking at things. Okay? So I've now made things a lot more difficult, but I hope to convince you by the end of the talk that it's also a lot more productive. Okay? So this frame of thinking that I've just outlined, I think exhibits itself today in wide swaths, wide areas of development economics thinking. It exhibits itself on the current thinking in growth, in macroeconomics. It also exhibits itself in microeconomics of development, where there's much less sort of these ideas, I think, have been taken on board as well. I want to start by saying a few words about how these ideas are being put into practice in the area of thinking about economic growth, and I'll say a little bit about the microeconomics of development and the recent focus on randomized evaluations as a key tool in thinking about economic policy in a microeconomic setting. But let me start with economic growth. And here, my colleagues and I have been working on this framework called the growth diagnostics, which is essentially just an application into areas of economic growth of the kind of ideas of this sort of new frame of mind that I've been outlining. So the central ideas in growth diagnostics is first that, as I said before, that binding constraints on growth differ across countries, and they differ within countries over time. Okay? So China, for example, early in its development history, in the late 70s, early 1980s, was very clearly constrained, first and foremost, by poor supply incentives in agriculture. Okay? So that was addressed through reforms in the household responsibility system, through its reforms in pricing in agriculture. And then later on, other constraints became binding. I'll come back to talk a little bit more about China in a couple of minutes. Okay? Brazil today is arguably constrained most by inadequate supply of credit. Brazil, there's entrepreneurship runs rampant in Brazil today, and the key binding constraint is high real interest rates, which reflects the inadequate supply of credit. So here's an economy where what's binding is the supply of loanable funds, the supply of credit, and the availability of saving, not necessarily the demand for investment. Okay? You turn to a country like El Salvador, which is completely different. There are no supply-side constraints on credit in the Salvadoran economy. What's clearly binding is investment demand, and in particular, lack of adequate incentives for investment and production in the tradable parts of the economy. So here the binding constraint is very much that entrepreneurs can get all the money that they want for investment purposes, but they just don't see any profitable investment activities. This is very different from Brazil. South Africa is arguably constrained by inadequate employment incentives in manufacturing and other tradable parts of the economy. That, I would argue, is the #1 constraint that both creates high unemployment in South Africa, also prevents it from growing on a sustainable basis. Turn to other countries in Africa, like Zimbabwe, and you say the real problem is poor governance, poor institutions. Right? The point is that in all of these things, some analysis might lead you to think that where the biggest bang for the reform buck is going to be different. And you're going to be wasting a lot of unnecessary effort if you go to these countries and miss the binding constraint. If you go to South Africa and Brazil, say the problem is governance. If you go to El Salvador and say the problem is bad institutions or inadequate financial markets, you're going to be not as effective as you could have been. The second key element in thinking about growth diagnostics is that sort of once you've identified what the plausible binding constraints are, that's only the first stage. Then you need to think about, how do I unlock those constraints? How do I relax these kinds of constraints? Okay? And it's not always very easy, because you need to be creative. Here's where experimentation comes and becomes important. You need to be creative and innovative in finding the kinds of policies that will actually both address the constraint, but do so in ways that are consistent with the local institutional and political realities, and takes into account various potentially adverse second-best interactions that might arise from the fact that you're doing this in a piecemeal fashion. Okay? So in the case of China, you might have gone and told the Chinese in 1978 that you're facing the supply problem in agriculture, and therefore what you need to do is simply liberalize agricultural markets and move to private ownership in land. That would have been the first best, best practice, textbook kind of a solution to their binding constraint at the time. And the Chinese government would have said, that's very nice, goodbye, go back and come back in another 20 years. Yeah? Because this is not how they could have addressed the problem. So they needed to find alternative ways that respected the constraint that you couldn't privatize land, that you couldn't liberalize agricultural prices without taking care of the adverse fiscal consequences of price liberalization that would have created. Okay? There were all kinds of interactions that first best policy doesn't necessarily take into account, and that's where thinking innovatively comes into mind. So you need to be experimental, selective, and pragmatic. And third, the third step is to realize that if you're doing this, that this is an ongoing process, because to the extent that you're successful in unlocking or relaxing some binding constraint, right, you know that you're successful if some other constraint becomes binding down the road. So this can't be just a one-time process. Right? You need to be doing this in an ongoing fashion. So this diagnostic frame of mind has got to be an ongoing one, both because sort of the the nature of binding constraints change over time, and because you need to build the kind of resilience to external shocks. And therefore, you need to strengthen your institutions so that this practice of diagnostics, experimentation, and policy innovation becomes an ongoing process, becomes institutionalized, it becomes the way that you actually are doing and carrying out policy. Okay? So institutions are very important. I'm coming back to governance through some back door. But notice what I'm saying. I'm just saying these institutions are important, not necessarily to get economies to grow, but to sustain their growth into the medium and long term, which is very different from saying that you need deep institutional reform just to get growth growing in the first place. Okay? So in that way, this is very different. Okay? So therefore, with that, you have essentially those three stages of doing the work of growth diagnostics. Becomes identifying the binding constraints. The second stage becomes the policy design, and the third stage becomes the institutionalization of the diagnostic process. Okay, and I think successful countries, and I'll turn to China next, just to put some flesh on these ideas. Successful countries are doing this as a matter of fact. They're doing this because this is how they work. So if you look at what has happened in China since the late 1970s, it's very much something along these lines, because their reform efforts have been very pragmatic and often highly unorthodox. I gave the example of how they dealt with supply-side incentives, and I think you can understand the heterodoxy in their approach by understanding the particular kind of constraints that they operate under, and that these heterodox approaches are ways of overcoming or making an advantage of their particular institutional constraints. So you've had the experience, I'm just going to go through these rather quickly just to sort of highlight some of these issues. The example of two-track pricing that I just mentioned before was a very creative way of insulating the public finance consequences of providing supply incentives in agriculture, which the standard agricultural liberalization would have messed up very badly. In fact, we've seen this in the Russian context, where they did across the board, and many other former Soviet countries that did across the board price liberalization. The moment that they do that, of course, the fiscal revenues of the state collapse, because built into that pricing system before were implicit tax revenues for the government, and that fiscal support collapses, then what do you have? You get hyperinflation, because now you have to monetize your deficit. It's a clear example of how overlooking these second-best interactions with the rest of the economy can be the enemy of best practice reforms. The household responsibility system that I mentioned briefly, which was a way of providing, once again, for investment incentives over long term for farmers without undertaking formal ownership reform, which would have been impossible for a communist country to do. In industrial areas, the practice of the township and village enterprises, which were sort of non-private enterprises owned essentially by local governments, very unorthodox form of ownership, I think were essentially a means of overcoming weakness in the legal system. That it turned out that investors and entrepreneurs felt a lot safer to invest when local communities became their protector, as opposed to the best practice of total private ownership, where they would have had to rely on a very weak and ineffective court system to protect themselves against local governments, which would have been, in practice, a disaster. So special economic zones to foster export orientation and outward orientation. Again, a very different, unorthodox way of opening up and integrating into the world economy. And I think one key difference that this made was that if they had opened it up the way that Latin America did, which was through import liberalization, that would have led to a collapse of employment in the state enterprises and a much greater problem with unemployment and social strife than the manner in which China ended up doing this. I could keep going on, but the problem is that these were all instances of how very specific constraints were targeted at different points in time with unorthodox, innovative, experimental measures. Okay? And then this sequential approach first started in agriculture, where the main constraints were, then moved on to industry, then to foreign trade, then to finance, and it's still going on. Okay? Now, China is now not by all means out of the woods, just to make clear that there are a lot of remaining institutional challenges that China faces. But I think the record up until now in terms of overall economic growth has been exemplary, and I think it's the premier example of this kind of doing reform that I just mentioned. Here is actually something that quantifies the deeply experimental nature of Chinese policymaking. This is an enumeration of, I don't know if you can actually read, you actually can read it. So those two lines are the share of regulations which were explicitly stated as being experimental. So these were explicitly stamped on page 1 as this is an experimental provisional measure to achieve this or that. Okay, you can see that in the late 70s and into the well into the 1980s, between 30–40% of all regulations, economic and national regulations, were explicitly experimental. That is, that they were just trying these things out, and when it worked, they kept. When they didn't work, they weren't kept. Okay? Interestingly, you can see how this has come down over time, especially after 2001. 2001 is the year that China happens to have entered the World Trade Organization. And this is one of the somewhat sort of unanticipated consequences, to some extent perhaps undesirable, that as China moves more and more towards a Western legalistic type of policymaking, that it's losing its ability to do this kind of experimental reform as I've highlighted. I think the sort of the language of growth diagnostics has been is now used sometimes to my horror quite widely. There are many different studies that is being used, and I would have to say the actual practice is somewhat mixed. I think there are a number of difficulties that you need to invest considerably in understanding a story's growth experience, and particularly if you can look at it from the standpoint of a bureaucracy, like the World Bank, which has in some sense taken on the language of growth diagnostics, but still there's a tension between this innovative, invest in a country, figuring out what the growth story of a country is, advocate different policies for different countries. That's very hard to do for a bureaucracy because it's so much easier to just have sort of one standard line that you apply to different countries regardless of circumstances. Okay? Let me just say a few words with regard to the sort of the micro development. Some of the most exciting developments in development economics, as I'm sure you're aware, in the last 10 years or so have come through randomized evaluations, the spread of randomized evaluations in micro-development, where you're trying to figure out what works. And so you go and, if you want to figure out whether you should give out, let's say, free bed nets, you go to Kenya, a bunch of villages in western part of Kenya, and you do this in a randomized trial fashion. So you give, free bed nets in some villages, then you have some control villages that don't receive the free bed nets. Then you go back 6 months and a year later and see how the control, the treatment villages compare in terms of health outcomes, take up of bed nets and so forth to the control villages, and you can figure out whether that something like this worked or not, and you can go back and try other things. This has been very successful and in many ways it sort of has taken the profession by storm, because it has a very powerful hold on being able to identify the effects of a policy intervention, but I'm going to emphasize, identify the effects of an intervention in a very specific setting. Okay? So the first point I want to say with respect to randomized evaluations in microdevelopment is that it too, I think, to my mind, reflects very much the transition from, in microeconomics of development, from a presumptive mode to a diagnostic mode, where you look at what the practitioners of these randomized evaluations are doing. They're going into each one of these locales, communities, with very open mind as to what may work, what may not work. And they experiment. They say, well, maybe, what you need to get to sort of make teachers in a school in India show up is to give kids in the classroom cameras. So they'll actually take the picture of the teacher to see whether the picture was in class or not. Right? This is not the kind of policy that the World Bank will come up with. This is the kind of problem that you come up with after sort of spending time in the communities and trying to get a sense, well, maybe something like this will work. So in that sense, in spirit, it's very similar to what I've identified as the basic guiding force in growth diagnostics. Now, micro-development economists who are doing this, I think, go considerable further and say that this is actually the only way, that they say that randomized evaluations essentially are the gold standard, in the sense that it's only through randomized evaluations that you can acquire knowledge, because these randomized evaluations, thanks to these sort of controlled trials, allow you to identify the effect of an intervention and get over a whole bunch of statistical problems that other kinds of evaluations have to suffer. Now, I am a little bit skeptical that, in fact, there is such a gold standard. And I think the point that I want to make is that the evidence that one gets from randomized evaluations really is hard in, sort of in a physical science sense of the word, only in the specific context of the intervention in question. So if you've carried out this intervention in Western Kenya, then you've really learned something about Western Kenya. But it's not actually clear what if you've learned something about how a similar intervention would work in Ethiopia, or how similar intervention would work in Ghana, okay? Because the context is going to be specific. So what happens is that if you want to learn something, if you want to apply it to another setting, inevitably you'll need to extrapolate. And that's where the softness of the analysis inevitably comes in. It's not that the result of the experiment in Kenya is not useful, it is useful. But if you're going to generalize from that, if you're going to use it in another setting, you are inevitably going to have to combine soft evidence in order to extrapolate from that particular study. So ultimately, when it comes to sort of being able to say something about the issues that you really care about, not in the specific locales that you've actually studied them, but more in general, you are going to be employing very similar kinds of arguments to convince the skeptic that you ended up employing in other areas of economics. Okay? The issues might be somewhat different, but in both areas, there's going to be some kind of arm waving or hand waving, and there are more convincing, more appropriate forms of hand waving and less convincing forms. But it is not that the randomized evaluation is definitely giving you the information that you want in ways that macro studies are unable to. I think I would, randomized evaluations have been extremely successful and useful, but I just want to say that that we don't want to think of them as distinctly hard in comparisons to other kinds of evidence that development economists use. And I think, perhaps the more important contribution of this micro-experimental approach has been to once again, to sort of reinforce this trend towards a more of an experimental diagnostic approach to thinking about development policy. And that's where I think there has been an interesting convergence between macro and micro on thinking about development policy, although I have to say that many people who do randomized evaluation hate the idea of anything that converges with macro development. But I think there's more to it than they allow. Let me just finish by giving out some of the arguments. So I'm going to preempt some of your criticisms because I've heard enough about what people say when I present these arguments about growth diagnostics in particular. So I just want to finish up by just highlighting some of the kinds of criticisms that I've heard and my responses to them. So one criticism that I hear a lot is, well, this is fine, but you have to understand, poor nations are poor because they suffer many constraints. So it's not just one binding constraint. There's a lot of constraints. My answer is, of course, but this is not an argument against the need to prioritize. And in fact, in many of the presumptive approaches, in practice, you are being forced to prioritize too, whether you like it or not. But the prioritization ends up in practice not to be based on economic reasoning or on this kind of let's target the most binding constraint kind of thinking, but it tends to be done on the basis of either political considerations, it tends to be on the basis of, okay, what can we do first? And so in that sense, it's not that you're not prioritizing in any way, but this is a way of doing your priority, getting your priorities straight. The second thing, which I think is fundamental, is actually thinking about what constraints, what the binding constraint is. You have to have a story. You have to have what an economist would call a model of the economy that you're studying. Because in the absence of having a story about what makes this economy work or not work, right, you cannot identify where the binding constraints are. And getting that story straight or being clear about what that model is going to be difficult. Okay? And my response to is that's absolutely right. But you cannot really make progress. You cannot be very successful about figuring out what you're going to be doing without actually studying that economy and figuring out why that economy is ticking or not ticking. So this is not a disadvantage. The fact that you have to do that work is an advantage. It's not a disadvantage. Third, well, how can you be sure that you've identified the binding constraints correctly? And the answer is you can't. But I find that even when there is a lot of uncertainty about where the binding constraints are, that the logic of thinking in terms of binding constraints actually provides a very useful way of framing a discussion over different recommendations. So if somebody is recommending fiscal policy and another person is recommending labor market reform, right, it has to be the case that the first person thinks that, let's say, fiscal imbalances are the binding constraint, and the second person is thinking labor market rigidities are the binding constraint. Okay? The moment you put it in the context of binding constraints, then you say, okay, if that is true, what else must follow? Do we actually see the various signals that this economy emits that is consistent with the binding constraint that you're positing? So it provides a framework for actually having a useful discussion about whether the first guy is right or the second guy is right. And the final comment that I hear about this, that doing growth diagnostics is hard. And my answer to that is yes, it is. But once again, I come back to where I started with, which is the easiest thing in the world is just to learn a few good things, rules of thumb that all ought to be doing, and then go home and take them. I know that here at CDE, you have a very long and distinguished tradition of not doing economics and economic policy in that way. As I tell my students, I hope that I will be teaching you how to think and not what to think. And I think there's no area to which sort of applying that logic, that approach, is more relevant than in development economics. And I think what I hope I've shown you is that even if we cannot agree on what is it that development policy requires, because that's very highly context specific, we can actually agree on a way of doing development economics, on a way of figuring out what development policy ought to be. And that habit of mind, that frame of thinking, I find, is very productive and is also quite consistent with the evidence of success and failure that we see around the world. So let me just stop here and thank you for your attention.
Okay, Dani has agreed to take some questions, so please let loose.
A few quick points. I think random evaluation, those studies, the ones that I've seen, seem to be driven by the Millennium Development Goals. And if that is the case, then the mindset is presumptive, even though I agree it's experimental, but the mindset that's driving it seems to be. Also, it seems that there is an implicit universality in the approach that you are suggesting, in the sense that ultimately you need good managerial capacity, whether on a small level or a larger level. And at least those of us who recommend industrial policy seem to think that evidence is suggesting that there are dynamic efficiencies inherent, and so the prescription is based on evidence rather than coming from the sky.
I tend to agree that there are good reasons for industrial policy, and so I would say that countries may differ depending on whether that's because it's so demanding precisely on managerial capacity, whether it's the first order of business or where it's not. So I know some countries where, let me mention, where the exchange rate is so overvalued that no amount of industrial policy will actually do anything. So, it's not going to be necessarily something that you'll want to put a priority. You'll figure out how to, achieve a significant real devaluation. That's going to be a very different thing. And other countries where that might have a big role to play. On managerial capacity specifically, I would say that my way of thinking, it requires more managerial capacity, but it also economizes on managerial capacity. Because remember, one of the things that I'm saying is that you don't, in order to get developing countries to moving, in order to achieve some outcomes, you don't have to do a whole lot of things all at the same time. So nothing requires more managerial capacity than actually the Washington Consensus. Nothing requires more managerial capacity than the World Bank's governance agenda. Those are incredibly intensive in managerial capacity. Millennium Development Goals, it's the same. Yeah? So my approach is saying, yes, you will have to invest a lot and learn a lot in a specific area. So there's some thinking that needs to be done, but you don't need necessarily to spread your managerial administrative capacities so thinly if you're doing this on a sequential, let's solve each binding constraint problem as it comes up kind of approach. And I would disagree a little bit with the first statement that I think most people who are doing randomized evaluations actually aren't great fans of Millennium Development Goals. Precisely because they have this attitude that don't tell me what the targets are. Because that's not necessarily you establish a target for school enrollment, and governments are going to achieve that by just filling classrooms with 60, 70 kids, and nobody's going to learn anything. And ultimately, it looks like you've satisfied your Millennium Development Goal with respect to education, but there's no learning going on in the classroom. So I think people who do randomized evaluations are actually quite sensitive to that point. And so I don't think they are doing it for MDGs. There's a question over there.
You're posing presumptive versus both diagnostics as a dichotomy, but it sounds as though there's certain things, for example, extreme social disorder, that might be a presumptive goal that can be readily identified, or your earlier example of a highly overvalued exchange rate. So are these really a dichotomy, or is growth diagnostics a technique that comes into play when you have some ambiguity as to whether or not something is truly a constraint that requires a presumptive solution or not?
Excuse excuse me. So in the case of the exchange rate, I mean, I think the way that I see that coming up in the context of a growth diagnostic exercise is you look at a country and then you say, you know, how come this country is not growing rapidly? How come there isn't investment? And then, you know, one of the sort of going down that decision tree, one of the nodes that you might reach is, well, you know, people aren't investing because there isn't enough incentives to invest in the most dynamic parts of the economy, the tradable parts. So that then you reach the conclusion, it's not a presumption, you reach the conclusion that relative profitability of tradables in this economy is very low. That's the result of the diagnostic analysis. And then you say, okay, the second stage of the analysis, then how am I going to solve this? How am I going to address, or am I going to relax this constraint, where the constraint is low relative profitability of tradables? Then the first thing that comes to your mind is, of course, the real exchange rate. And then you say, okay, what kind of a monetary regime or exchange rate regime is this country on? And sometimes you'll be, as in the in a dollarized economy where, you know, there is no exchange rate you can change. Then you'll have to be innovative and try to figure out other ways of changing the real exchange rate, but not through the normal exchange rate. So that's different from just sort of, you know, going at it, let's say, the Washington consensus way, when you say, okay, number 4 on the agenda is competitive exchange rate. Okay? And you know that the moment you've stepped foot on you know, off the plane in that country. Yeah.
So, you know, this whole business of identifying the binding constraints seems sort of magical, mysterious to me. And I wonder if you have yet, or you think you will have someday, a mapping from evidence to different kinds of evidence to binding constraints. A context-free mapping like that you can then hand to the World Bank and you make the practice of World Bank easier, because otherwise it seems...
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not magical, but I don't think we can achieve what you're saying. I mean, I think it's always going to be model specific. So you always need to use economic tools, economic logic. Let me give you a kind of example that that helps. So what we try to do is not give a blueprint, because I don't think that's going to work. So, you know, a checklist. You know, here's what you need to do, what you call the context-specific sort of mapping. But there is a certain way of thinking that helps you distinguish whether something is a binding constraint or not. I'll give you a couple of examples. So one of the key things that you say, okay, if you go to a country like, let's say, Brazil, and you say, you know, low investment in this country, and, you know, the proximate reason why the economy isn't growing is that private investment is low. And then you say, well, you know, okay, here's the first decision you have to make with respect to what the binding constraint is. Is the investment low because investment demand is low, or because the supply of savings or the supply of investable funds is low? In other words, what's binding? Is it a problem on the demand side, or is it a problem on the supply side? Okay? The moment you say that, okay, you say, how am I going to discriminate between these two stories? Well, that's when you start using your economic logic and says, well, you know, if the problem is on the supply side, right, that in other words, investment demand is high, but is what's really keeping investment is lack of adequate investable funds, then a number of things that follow that you ought to be able to observe. For example, it would be that if for exogenous reasons that supply constraint is relaxed, then you should see the result in high investment, not high consumption. Okay? And then you look at Brazil, you say, that's really how Brazil works. The moment the external financing constraint relaxes, investment goes up, growth goes up. So Brazil works very much like an economy where if you had more fund to invest, and that's not always the case. You look at the Salvadoran economy, if there are more money coming from abroad, let's say in the form of remittances or more, it doesn't go into investment. It goes into reduced saving, actually reduced domestic saving and increased consumption. So you look at a country like Salvador, and there you say that here the constraint is very different from Brazil. It's not that there is inadequate investable funds. It's actually inadequate investment demand. You've already made a hugely important discovery between these two countries. Because now you know that you're going to moving down sort of different part of the decision tree. And in the case of Brazil, you're going to then try to figure out what keeps the supply of investable funds low. And in Salvador, you're going to be looking at what keeps investment demand low. And that's going to take you down and at each node of this decision tree, you can identify different possibilities, ask the same kind of questions about if hypothesis 1 was true versus 2, what would you see in the economy? And you can do this at very, very different levels. You can do it at the economy-wide level. You can do it for the modern sector. You can do it for a part of the region. But this is, and ultimately, of course, you're not going to be nailing it down, one. But it already helps a lot because it tells you that in the case of Brazil, you don't want to put a lot of effort at, let's say, improving the business environment. For a while, the World Bank thought the problem with Brazil was the business environment. No, the evidence says that, as bad as the investment environment might be, what's really binding is the supply of funds. It's not the demand for funds, So that's not going to be a particularly productive area of reform. So there are a lot of, tricks like that in terms of thinking with a combination of conceptual theoretical thinking and using data and empirics creatively to try to resolve these questions at every node of this decision tree. And that only gets you the first stage, which is to identify where the constraint might be. Then the second stage, you have to think about, okay, what type of policies and so forth. Yeah.
Imagine that you have two people in your audience, Paul Volcker and the chairman of Goldman Sachs. Can you put yourself in their places and imagine what they are saying about what they just heard you say?
Well, I think Paul Volcker will like it, and I don't think the chairman of Goldman Sachs will like it. I think Paul Volcker will like it because I think he has been, in general, very skeptical about our off the textbook kind of solutions to economic problems. In that sense, he has been a critic of, the textbook economics. And so for that reason, I think that, all of this would sound very reasonable. In fact, I don't think I've said anything unreasonable except probably, if you have had many years of economics, some of the things that I've said may sound unreasonable. But if you haven't, then probably, my mother worries why they pay me. If I say things like this, it just sounds so sensible and reasonable that, doesn't everybody know this also, So there's something about, too much training in economics. What do I say about Goldman Sachs? I think, that, one thing about running a big financial institution is you want standardization. So, the one thing that, big Wall Street firms want is not to have to encounter transaction costs around the world. So they can do business around the world in quite the same way. And my approach here is very inimical to that, because I just want to say that different countries may actually dance to their own tunes. They may, for example, in the area of finance, they may decide that the way that they want to regulate their financial sectors might be very different than what the Basel rules are, or what the Financial Stability Board thinks, or what the IMF thinks. This is not something that is very, it's not a very nice scenario for people in financial, in Wall Street and financial sectors, because they want to have the same rules everywhere. So they can operate relatively easily across the borders. That's why, they want sort of, global rules, sort of make sure that Europe and the United States don't have different rules on regulation and things like that. So I'm taking liberty from sort of, you're having taken liberty from my talk to ask me that question. I'm taking liberty of, the question that you posed me. And I may be completely wrong about the reactions, but that would be my guess. Yeah.
I'm a sophomore from Williams College, and my question is, from a purely academic point of view, this growth diagnostic makes perfect sense. But growth is more concerned with policy making. And if we take into account the political economy part of it, will this overly flexible approach allow, give a room for politicians to, find scapegoat instead of finding the true binding constraints, and thus giving to Jacksonian populism? Maybe we just find some countries saying, oh, this country has an undervalued currency, thus that's why we cannot develop. So is that possible?
Yeah, so, I'm just going to put it in different words. Are we empowering the barbarians? And I think this is sort of I think it's a fundamental question in economics. I think, the reason that economists sort of, it's way too late to go into this at great length, but because, it's a pet peeve of mine. Economists, when in the seminar room, in the professional room, sort of when they're in professionally, sort of are, they never generalize. It's always, the kind of things that I've discussed here, context, specificity, second best, this is the bread and butter of the academic economist. And yet, when it comes to sort of advising developing countries, advising policy, often these people who can think of, multiple tracks, they become just one track all of a sudden. And I think the reason is that there is this sense that you've articulated, which is that you can't trust governments with too many things. So you basically, if you tell them that things are complicated and you figure it out on your own, that the governments will basically do what you're suggesting, which is sort of, abuse their freedom. And my answer to that is, I think it's a misleading choice. That governments will always do what they want to do. And I think one thing that we've learned from the Washington Consensus, or for that matter, the import substitution. Import substitution worked very well in a number of countries and worked very badly in others. It had to do a lot with whether governments, in the end, used these ideas for good purposes or for bad purposes. It wasn't, and you couldn't have avoided it. The Washington Consensus is the same. Some countries did relatively well with it. Others, went nowhere. It's because, just because, sort of, the point is that these governments are sovereign, and, you won't be able to constrain them. If you constrain them here, what they want to do will come out from there. So I sort of see this as a false choice, and so you better. And particularly as an economist, you need to sort of be honest. And the worst thing to do, I think, as an economic policy maker, policy advisor, is to suggest not what you think is economically the right policy, but another one, because you think that if you suggest the right economic policy, that the politician is going to abuse it. Yeah? No, I mean, I think that's just doesn't make any sense.
So what would be the roles of governments around the world in terms of adopting your GD development approach?
So I missed the first part of your question.
Of the governments around the world
Yeah.
to adopt this approach. Should there be bigger planning agency? What are these?
I'm not sure. First, I mean, I'm glad you asked this question because I think, this is something I should have mentioned, but your question gives me opportunity to say that. I believe that, that the practitioners of this craft really have to be the local government. They have to be the locals, the governments, the national governments. You can't look at the World Bank or regional development banks or bilateral aid donors to be the ones who are supplying this. Because there's, that it requires deep knowledge of the economy, it requires knowledge of what's feasible and what's doable, and it requires the ability to be flexible, which large bureaucracies aren't, because they have difficulty recommending A to one country and not A to another. So for all those reasons, I think this work, first of all, as you suggest, has to be done. This work won't be successful unless it is done by domestic government, by national governments. I don't think, where this work is done, I think it depends on the institutional setting of different countries. If you already have a planning agency with a lot of human capital, and then it would be a natural place to do. But it depends on where the talent and where your, sort of the thinking is located. If you don't have one, it's up to you where you create it. But it's clear that, you need some concentration. It could be done together with sort of local think tanks. Domestic academics and so forth can play a role. And certainly, multilaterals can help, provide some feedback and provide some human resources. But, where it is done depends on where the resources are and what your institutional capacity is already located.
There's one way back there, and then we should probably wrap up.
Me, please. Okay. I have too many questions. Okay, allow me to. First, how do you reframe educational standards of colleges and especially CDE based on your approach? This is my first question. And second, if you have to select between second best and third best, you have to impose some criteria that presumptive by nature. So what's the way out?
I mean, on your first question, I'm not sure I can say anything at all. On second best, third, I mean, I think the real distinction is between first best and second best. All third best, fourth best, fifth best, they're all subsets of the second best. And I think there's a big distinction, and what I've tried to argue here is that what you really need to be doing is very much second best kind of thinking, and not first best kind of thinking. I think a lot of the presumptive way of thinking about economic policy is based on the notion that if we get enough reforms done all together, then we can approach the first best. That never works. Just the list is way too long, and it's sort of like saying, Zambia. The way to solve Zambia's problems is to make sure that it looks like Sweden. Okay, now that's not a development strategy, because by the time you've listed all the things that Zambia has got to do under the presumptive mode, you've already turned Zambia into Sweden. So it's just. And so that's the first best mode. And the second best mode is to say, we need to be sequential, we need to do our targeting, and therefore we need to inherently think about how to do this in a second best kind of a way, do just first things, some things first. As my own teacher and a great economist, Avinash Dixit, likes to say, everything is at best second best.
Okay, one more, last one.
I'm Alassane Koulibaly, CD student. I'm wondering about how to implement, that model, that growth diagnostic. Since I know that in most of developing countries, most of the countries found come from, World Bank or other multilateral financial institutions. So most of the time we have some condition with those funds. So, and another thing is that sometimes also we have some specific, institution who say, okay, I want to give you money, but you have to use it in that specific sector. So how do those government can, use, how they can, what they can do to implement that thing with all of those kind of constraints of.
Yeah, I think you're making a very, very good point, which is that in practice you will find the donors have very, very different priorities, and then and those priorities may not match very well with your own sense of what your needs and priorities are, especially if they're the product of some of this kind of thinking. I have to say though that in practice, when in my travels and when I talk to governments, I don't see that this is, to use the same term again, that I don't see the foreign lenders' prioritization being a binding constraint on whether developing country governments can do what they want to do or not. I see developing country governments not investing enough effort on their own priorities and expecting too much from the donors, in particular multilaterals, to formulate what those constraints are. Now, it used to be a time, and I think this is where the World Bank, I think, has actually moved forward. There used to be a time that the World Bank would have a much stronger view on what you needed to do. But they've taken over some of this thinking. And therefore, I think there's much greater openness now on the part of the World Bank and other multilaterals when they face a government that has a very well-formed sense of its priorities and has a rational argument for those. And I think today you find much greater receptivity for this. Now, so I find that too often the problem is that the governments themselves aren't articulating these and instead turning around and saying, okay, what do we need to do to get the World Bank to loan us? Or instead of investing in sort of what is it that, where should our priorities and our areas of reform, or what is it that we ought to be doing? So there are some countries that are doing it, and they'll be very choosy, right? I mean, a country like Ethiopia will say, well, I am not interested in financial reform. That's not my priority. So don't come to me with a financial sector loan. I don't want it, because I don't want to take your conditionality there. I'm not interested. But if you want to sort of give me loan to increase agricultural productivity, I'm very interested in that. So I think it's doable. And I think what's the reality on the ground is that that there's not enough work being done by the domestic governments.
Okay, this is not my presumptive prescription, but rather my careful diagnosis that we've had an excellent talk tonight. And so I would invite you to join me in thanking Dani Rodrik.